Hi everyone, I'm Kyle Bechet, and this is the AAF Exchange, a podcast from the American Action Forum, where experts provide clear, data-driven insights into today's economic and domestic policy issues. Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. On this episode of the AAF Exchange, the lame duck funding challenge, the tax reform debate, and immigration in the first 100 days. Joining us to discuss all this is AAF President Douglas Holtz-Eakin. Doug, thanks for joining us.
It is always a joy to be on the podcast.
Yes. So before we get into everything, tell us what's been on your mind recently.
Well, I'm still staring at the Fed, trying to figure out where they are, what they're thinking. We've had a fair amount of interesting public discussion. Governor Bowman saying, we should really be careful with any more cuts. We might not need to make any more. That's a pretty. She did dissent in September, but that's a pretty firm public position. That's not. We're on the path to lower rates. Waller expressed some need for the data to convince them to cut, and even the chairman said, "Look, we're in no hurry to cut. The economy looks pretty strong." So I don't know if this is a sort of rereading of the data in the aftermath of the 50 basis point cut in September, or if this is just the internal politics of the board spilling out into public. Could be either, could be both. But the data are, making it harder for the messaging, right? We've got a CPI that went up, not down. We've got a core CPI that's been stuck at 3.2 or 3.3 for 6 months. We've got shelter inflation that the Cleveland Fed just said is going to stick around for another 18 months. That's a third of the CPI. Now, I get it. That's not their preferred indicator. They want to tell everyone to look at other indicators. But, if people are living through what they buy in the CPI and the Fed's telling them inflation's coming down, the messaging is going to get hard. Yeah. And that's without reacting to the new policies of the Trump administration, which could make their life incredibly complicated.
Right. Yeah, I'm sure. I think we've talked about in previous podcasts that they're definitely running the traps, the models on what a potential Trump presidency could bring in terms of inflation. You wrote a dish either this week or last week about how rent increases could be sticky. You had that dish about the CPI that you mentioned with so if we're seeing the data, then they absolutely are looking at it.
Yeah, they have to be looking at it. Again, I think everyone got fooled by how easy things came down in 2023. This year's been a different story. Yeah. Remember, the first 3 months of the year, there was no progress. People were really getting quite concerned. All of those rate cuts that people had priced into the market in January disappeared. Right. They did some cuts. Now they're like, well, and I would not be surprised to see them go on hold in December and wait and get more data not contaminated by hurricanes and things. Right. That's part of the problem. And also, if they're going to cutting on the new president's watch is a favor that he may appreciate, and he might not scream at them for 1 month. Maybe. Who knows?
Yeah, we'll have to wait and see on that one. All right, let's turn to the lame duck session, well underway right now. Yes. Obviously, Congress's must-to-do list is the biggest thing.
Can I say something on the podcast? So what have they accomplished in the lame duck? Nothing. Think back to October and the list of things everyone said they're going to do in the lame duck. This happens all the time. Yeah. So listeners, never believe what people say in October about all this stuff they're going to get done in the lame duck.
I think it's an annual podcast that we do at this point where we are approaching, we've been through at least two. The podcast has been going on for at least 3 elections now, and where we talk about, okay, what's going to happen in the lame duck. And I think every time we end the podcast by saying, all that stuff we just talked about probably won't even show up. Right. So, we'll have to wait and see. But anyways, there is one big must-to-do item on the list. That is, of course, funding the government. Speaker Johnson has proposed a short-term funding gap bill to keep the government running past December 20th. That's the deadline. What do you make of this strategy?
So the choices are do a big omnibus appropriations bill that funds everybody through September 30th and takes fiscal year 2025 off the table. That clears the decks somewhat for the new administration's priorities in the first couple months of next year. Or what Speaker Johnson has said, which is, no. We do a short-term CR into 2025, say March. At that point, we have the House, the Senate, and the White House, and we get to put our imprint much more firmly on the spending bills, not just the levels, but what do the agencies do, and we should do that. We should take that opportunity to quickly impose the president's priorities, in particular, on the funding process. I think you can make the argument either way, quite frankly, and I think it's in his narrow interest to do the CR because they're members of the Republican caucus that find omnibus spending bills an anathema and just are a non-starter, and people who support them are a non-starter, and that would be the Speaker implicitly. He'd have to cut the deal with the Democrats in the Senate, and so that's political jeopardy he doesn't need. And so you can understand everybody in this game, quite frankly. And I don't know. I think it's probably going to end up where the Speaker is because he's the one who sort of sets the agenda.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I know there's like this thought about like, let's clear the decks and just get...
It's not a crazy thought.
Yeah.
It's not. I mean, if you're looking at the funding and the debt limits, the idea of just doing all that in the lame duck and then just starting on taxes and the extension of or revision to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, that's going to be a hard process.
Yeah.
You have over in the Senate, remember, they're going to be doing a lot of nominations. That's going to suck up a lot of the time, a lot of the oxygen. So do you really need on top of that a funding fight? Now remember, the appropriations bills are going to take 60 votes in the Senate, so it's not like having control of all the chambers makes it easier. Well, it makes it easier, but it doesn't make it, just they fly right through. You're going to have to negotiate with the Senate Democrats, get to yes.
This question came up in our pre-meeting to talk about this podcast, and we'll talk about the tax bill later, or the tax stuff later. But do they have to wait to do the budget, the instructions for reconciliation before to get do you have to finish this fiscal year before they can start worrying about the next fiscal year?
There's no constraint at all. They can come back January 3rd and begin the budget resolution process. They have to pass the same resolution, a concurrent resolution, in the House and Senate, which contains the reconciliation instructions, which allow them to build a reconciliation bill, and off you go. So
they don't have to finish this year's.
No, they don't. There's no restriction of that type. And indeed, like, when they did the Affordable Care Act, they pulled a budget resolution that was left on the table from the year before, dragged it out into the light of day and said, hey, let's pass this for last year. And they did, and that's how they finished that process.
Interesting. All right, well, like I said, we'll get to the tax bill in a second, but, aside from keeping the government funded, there are some other things that they tend to do. What else might come up?
The other big dollar item is going to be this supplemental bill for disaster relief, the hurricanes, and a million other things. Where, if you're reading the papers, this bill, which is at like $99 billion coming out of the administration's request, is likely to grow, not shrink. Now, I can remember when supplementals were $50 million. So. Yeah. That makes me old, I think. But this is an enormous amount of money, and it's covering everything from hurricane damage, North Carolina, Florida, to damage to bases in Guam. They went, that came up. Like, there's no money in there for the Guam Air Force bases. We got to do that. So there's a lot of needs out there that we're starting to hear about.
Interesting.
So they'll have to do that. Then there are the others, like, that they don't have to do, but they will do. The NDA, the National Defense Authorization Act, is one that both parties take pride in having done every year. They will do that. And that's the way they shape defense policy. It's also the way they attach all sorts of other things to get through the process. So that's the vehicle for a lot of things. And there's a whole slew of cats and dogs, things like flood programs that need to be extended. Of those, probably the biggest deal is the Farm Bill.
Yep.
So they'll have to get that done as well. So a relatively short list, and that's the right way to think about a lame duck. There's a bunch of things you have to do, and you do them.
Yeah, it seems like the Farm Bill might just be there's always some stuff around that, and there seems like there's not a lot of agreement. How likely do you think that's even going to be put on the table?
They have to do something. It got extended like the CR for a short while, and so they have to figure out how to get to next year, if nothing else. And it may be just that.
Just attaching it to a CR or something like that probably makes the most sense.
Some short-term extension as opposed to, hey, we finally did the work on the Farm Bill.
Interesting. Okay, what about the debt ceiling? I mean, that's looming over. That deadline is looming over all of this. Will it play a role in these debates?
It could. I think it depends on the degree of intra-party discipline among the Republicans and where they're all going to stand on that. I mean, we have seen two things. Number one, a Trump presidency where they raised the debt ceiling 3 times without particular public notice or controversy or political capital being spent. And number two, a reawakening in the Republican caucus of the awareness of deficits and concern over them. And this has been more words than action so far. But if some of this turns into, no, we're not going to quickly raise the debt ceiling, then it becomes an issue. Yeah. But if they just line up as a party, salute and suspend this, most likely they'll suspend, because then you don't have to name a number. We plan to issue a bunch of debt. Just leave that. Let's just not mention that. Yeah. And then suspend it for how long? Well, till after the midterm elections would be a nice thing. Yeah. So count on that. Yeah. That's where I think they end up.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned it's a time when people pay attention to the deficit. Well, we just had one of the largest single year deficits in history.
And it's not just the 1.8 trillion. That's a big number. It's 6.3% of GDP. Yeah. An economy at full employment, not at war. I mean, that's not a good thing. It's the fact that over $1 trillion of it was interest. Yeah. So you've got, borrowing just to pay interest on previous borrowing. If that doesn't frighten you, it should. And now we're starting to see, I think, genuine concern over this, as opposed to faux concern, which we've seen for years, but no action. I mean, people just did things. It's the biggest difference, and I think it's worth keeping track of, because it's the biggest difference to 2017 when they last did Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. The fiscal condition is so much worse.
Yeah. Speaking of taxes, I said we were going to get to that, and we are.
Here we are.
Yesterday, you testified.
Let's see. That's one of two things that's reliable in life. Are we going to do death in this as well?
Here we are. No promises. Yesterday, you testified before the Congressional Joint Economics Committee regarding the upcoming tax debate. What were your key points?
So there are two big problems with poor trend growth in the 21st century, which calls for pro-growth policies across the board, including taxes, and big debts. And so what you do with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act tax policy issue intersects directly with both of those. So you've got the need for pro-growth tax policy, but renewing it is a $4.7 trillion proposition relative to current law. A different way to think about it is that it keeps current policies in place, and current policies gave us $1.8 trillion in deficits. And so you're not making any progress if you just renew. But that seems to me the minimum bound. So what I said is, look, when you think about this, there are these trade-offs. The minimum is you do current policy, and anything that would add to deficits beyond current policy, you pay for. That would include everything the president proposed on the campaign trail, which was, as you know, a pretty extensive list. Yeah. So that, to me, seems like the minimum you ought to do. And then the gold standard would be to do, in reconciliation, a deficit-neutral tax reform and probably spending reforms to make it deficit-neutral. And that would be the gold standard because, number one, it would represent $4.7 trillion of progress on the fiscal problem. Good. And number two, they could make it permanent. If there are no deficits created, then you don't have to sunset things, which is why we're in this position. So they could do pro-growth tax policy, pair it with the spending reforms they need, and both would be permanent with no sunsets involved. That, to me, is the gold standard. And that's what I would hope they'd aim for, but I can't promise you they will.
Yes. I mean, you've definitely, you and Chairman Brady had, I think up to 3 Wall Street Journal op-eds basically emphasizing, it's an important time to build on the success of the TCJA, rather than just extending those current provisions. Yeah. And that would be the gold standard,
And here's something to keep in mind. Again, I think there's a lot of confusion about this out there because people are talking about more tax cuts. The truth is, the basic proposition is to extend what we have right now. So extend current policy. that's not going to change the growth trajectory very much.
Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. You're going to keep doing the same thing.
Yeah.
So this notion that somehow that we're going to get a big, either an explosive increase in deficits or an explosive increase in growth, neither is true if all you do is really extend.
Right.
You've got to do better policy.
Yeah, it's the same policy. I mean, so what are some of those, what are some of the things that Congress should focus on to make this a better bill? I mean, I think you do the things that they had to phase out that were really good growth policies, expensing of investment, expensing of R&D investments, things like that. Mm-hmm. Those are no-brainers to me. You do that. You then really clean up in some way the taxation of pass-through business income. That's more than half of all business income. It's now taxed on individual returns. You worry about high tax rates on business, especially smaller ones. That's part of the concern about letting the sunset. But in a bill that represented great simplification, the Section 199A pass-through regime is a great complication. Mm-hmm. And I just don't think anyone is happy with the outcome, and they should try again. Right. And that's the place to focus. Interesting. Yeah, and I mean, it's important to also continue a lot of these provisions because I think we've talked about this numerous times. Businesses aren't leaving headquarters aren't leaving the country anymore. We're keeping
the corporate reforms were a huge success.
Yeah,
and you can fine tune the international regime, the so-called GILTI and BEAT and FDII. These are all sort of international tax provisions. They need some work. But the real thing would be you simply don't want to let a sunset happen on more than half of business income and hammer every small business in America. So that's not going to happen. The question is, what's the most efficient way to avoid that?
Interesting. All right. Let's move on to my favorite section, the trivia section.
Oh, I thought this was the one when you left. Anyway, go ahead.
No, not yet. So you're not that lucky. I changed it up, so I'm not asking for a number this week. I'm asking
for a letter. B.
Yes. I'm asking for a number of letters.
Oh dear.
President Biden's regulatory cost total stands at about $1.8 trillion. Mm-hmm. About the same as what country's GDP?
Australia.
Correct. Yes.
Yes.
Which is also the same size
Aussie.
as the FY24 federal budget deficit.
Yes. Your inner Aussie or your inner budget geek, either will get you there.
It's astonishing, though, that just our regulatory costs alone are the size of a country's that size's GDP.
I've said this to you before. When Trump was first elected back and said we're going to do this, one in, two out, regulatory budgets, control the growth of the regulatory state, I was openly skeptical. Mm-hmm. Just proving I am a swamp dweller, there's no way they can do this. Mm-hmm. And the degree to which they succeeded was astounding to me, and remains astounding. We have the same team presumably coming back. They know how they did this. They're ready to go beginning day one. They don't take a year and a half to figure it out. Mm-hmm. The difference in the regulatory environment is going to be not just night and day, but it's going to be like the darkest night in history to bright neon. I mean, I don't know what's going on. I'm really looking to see how that affects things because there was a big increase in small business optimism in 2017. It was part of the sudden growth in the economy. People kept wanting to point to just the tax bill or just the spending bill or just what. I think the regulatory environment was a big deal there. Mm-hmm. And I want to see if we get a repeat of that.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, Dan Goldbeck was on last two weeks ago on the podcast talking about, it's important that they go through the process correctly.
Yes.
Because there's going to be court battles around some of this stuff. And in the wake of Chevron, this Chevron decision, the latest Chevron decision, that complicates things on the deregulatory side. So the courts can, not even on the deregulatory side, the deference and things like that. So yeah, I mean that's an interesting point.
It is a different environment.
It's good that they are good from not day one. All right, let's finish up with immigration.
Okay.
President-elect Trump has promised voters dramatic immigration reform when he takes office. What can we expect?
I think there are three pieces. There's border crossing and the illegal immigration that's in that. There, I think very quickly they will impose the border regime that was in place when he was president, stay in Mexico, a bigger presence on the border, and And I think there's bipartisan agreement that you have to be able to control the southern border better. I don't think that's a no-brainer. Then there's legal immigration reform. Kind of a wild card. He did at some point in the campaign say we should simply staple a green card to every diploma of a foreign-born student who graduates from a U.S. university. Lots of people have proposed something like that over the years. He's never appeared open to it. So that would be a big change if they actually moved legislation to reform the legal immigration system. It would be fantastic. Then the third and the most controversial is the mass deportation of those here illegally. And we've talked about the big budget costs that come with this, the big economic costs that come with this, the fact that you'd have to have ICE and or some other agents entering people's homes and businesses to find those who deserve to be deported. It just rips the fabric of American society. I see those costs as cumulatively politically too high to really do that and take at face value what he said. But they will do something. There will be some action that fulfills that campaign promise, and I expect to figure out what that is after the new year.
Yeah. I mean, AAF has on the last pillar there, if you will. AAF has published research on the costs of doing that mass deportation, and you certainly shared, as you just did, your skepticism about such a policy. I mean, can you give us any of the specifics about what that would look like in terms of the economics of? Oh
yeah, last time we checked this was 2015, right?
Yeah,
because we thought he proposed the same thing and he didn't. So one of the reasons I'm skeptical is we've seen this movie before. We proposed it. We priced it $400 to $600 billion in federal budget costs. Because you have to hire people to find folks. You have to hire administrative judges to hear their cases. You have to house them while all this is going on. So you have to build housing. You then have to return them to their country of origin. That requires planes and trains and cars and boats. And it's very, very, very expensive. At the time, it was about 6% of the labor force that was at risk. Well, if you take out 6% of your workers, you will produce less. And the transition to that is painful because you're going to have essentially a self-inflicted recession. And then ultimately, this took 20 years, in our view, to do all this. And they're claiming they're going to do it in the first year. Well, if you add the inflation we've had since we first did that and do it in a year, that price tag is over $1 trillion by now. I mean, I don't see, the president when he gets there and sort of looks at the lay of the land. It just seems like for someone who just won the popular vote, reshaped the party, has enormous backing, do you really want to pick that fight?
Yeah.
Because I think people don't like illegal immigration, and they don't like illegal immigrants, but they like their neighbor. If it turns out they're an illegal immigrant, it's different.
Yeah.
And so I might be wrong. I'm wrong a lot, but I just don't think they'll go there.
Yeah, it seems to me that the most likely outcome, and based off my read, is basically what your read is. The remain in Mexico policy, the other border stuff, that's coming back day one.
Yeah.
Maybe some stuff on the stapling the green cards to diplomas,
maybe,
and we'll have to wait and see, like maybe some symbolic type thing on the mass deportation stuff.
Yes, I expect something, but stopping any new illegal immigration would be an enormous accomplishment. So let's focus on that.
Right. Doug, any fun plans for your Thanksgiving holiday next week?
All of the children have left us behind, so Beth and I will have Thanksgiving dinner together at a very fine restaurant. That'll be great. And then the next day, we're going to see our grandkids, and that's always great fun.
Yes, that's always a good time. Yeah, I have nothing planned. I'll be here doing...
well, I hope you're here, actually.
No,
That'd
I will not be here, Doug. I will not be in the office.
Come on,
here.
Kyle.
By here, I mean I will be at my house doing anything but work things. So I will be watching a ton of football that day.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think I know what you'll be doing.
There's a strong bet that I'll be laughing at the Cowboys, in awe of the Lions, and I don't even know who the third game is.
So wait. Is the roof falling down just too good a metaphor for the Dallas Cowboys? I mean, come on. Like, literally the roof is falling in, Jerry.
It's the perfect metaphor. We'll leave it at that.
It's unbelievable.
All right, Doug, thanks for joining us, and I'll see you in a few weeks. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Tune back in for our next episode, where our experts will provide clear, data-driven insights into today's economic and domestic issues. I'd also encourage you to check out any of the links in our show notes, and also follow us on social media to learn more about AAF. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or Google Play.